Some things survive us. The smell of soap on old towels, the clock that keeps its own version of time, and sometimes, a letter. I found it by accident, though I no longer believe in accidents. It was resting inside a small tin box, under buttons, ribbons, and the kind of quiet that feels deliberate. My name was written on the front, but not for who I am now, for the woman I once was, and the mother I never truly understood. My name is Elena Marlowe, 63, widow. A woman who spent most of her life taking care of others and only recently discovered what it means to take care of herself. Once, I was a teacher, later, a wife, then, a mother. Now, I'm something else entirely, the after of all those things. I don't speak much anymore. Not because I've run out of words, but because I've finally learned to listen to the ones that live in silence. The house had been closed for months. When I turned the key, the lock sighed, as if it recognized my hesitation. Dust motes floated in the air, spinning like memories that didn't know where to land. The smell of lavender and old wood lingered in the hall. Everything here was both familiar and distant, like a language I used to speak fluently but hadn't used in years. I came back only to finish what grief never could. The small rituals of letting go, boxes to seal, drawers to empty, closets to close. But grief has a way of rearranging its purpose. You come to empty rooms, and they end up emptying you. I placed my bag on the hallway table, the one that still bore the faint circle from her favorite teacup. My hands moved without thought, following the muscle memory of a daughter who once knew where everything belonged. Teacups on the second shelf, sugar tin near the stove, kettle with the dent that never came out, the small map of our life together, still intact after 30 years. Water murmured to a boil. Steam rose and disappeared, leaving its ghost on the window pane. I poured a cup I didn't need, more for ceremony than thirst. There's a strange comfort in repeating the gestures of someone you've lost, as if by imitating their habits, you can borrow a little of their presence. The past doesn't return like a storm. It seeps back slowly, testing the edges of your patience. I walked through the living room, touching things I wasn't sure I had the right to touch anymore. A framed photograph of me at 12, haircut bluntly, smile forced, a sofa that had outlasted its purpose but refused to surrender. On its arm, the faint groove where her elbow used to rest. I ran my fingers over it. Wood remembers what skin forgets. In the bedroom, I opened her wardrobe. The smell of starch and cedar escaped, and for a moment, I almost called her name. Ridiculous, really, how quickly we revert to instinct when surrounded by what once defined us. Her clothes were still here, pressed, folded, patient. The colors muted by time, soft beige, worn blue, ivory. I touched one of her cardigans and felt a pulse beneath my fingertips. Not of life, but of continuity. At the top shelf, behind a stack of folded linens, was the tin box. Blue enamel, chipped at the corners. I remembered it vaguely. She kept spare buttons and old threads in it, the practical remnants of motherhood. I pulled it down carefully. The lid resisted for a second, then gave in with a small sigh. Inside, everything was where she had left it. Loose threads. A thimble. 2 tiny safety pins clinging to each other. And beneath it all, the envelope. Cream paper, softened at the edges, my name written in her unmistakable hand. Her handwriting had always been decisive, elegant, slightly tilted to the right, as if even her letters were leaning toward the future. But this was different. The ink was faint, the pressure uneven. The lines trembled, the way truth trembles when it's finally ready to be spoken. I sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope in my hands. It was cold, not like paper, but like something that had waited too long. I turned it over, tracing the flap with my thumb. The seal was intact, the glue slightly brittle. 30 years sealed inside one small act of hesitation. I didn't open it. Not yet. The weight of it was enough for now. It felt both light and unbearable, as if it contained the distance between who we were and who we never got to be. The house grew quiet around me. Or maybe it was always this quiet, and I was the one who'd grown loud in its absence. Outside, rain began. Not a storm, just the soft kind that makes you listen harder. It tapped against the window, gentle but insistent. I used to count raindrops on this same glass when I was little. She'd laugh softly and say, "You can't count rain, sweetheart. It's meant to be felt, not measured." Even now, her voice arrived exactly where it used to, somewhere between my ribs and my breath. I stood and carried the letter to the kitchen. The clock above the sink ticked steadily, though it had been years since anyone wound it. It ticked anyway, stubborn, faithful, unbothered by logic. I set the envelope on the table, beside the cup of tea that had already gone cold. The room smelled of rain and memory. Everything, including me, was suspended. I circled the table once, then again, as if orbiting an old planet that still had gravity. I tried to distract myself, wiped the counter, folded a towel, aligned the salt and sugar tins. But no matter what I did, my eyes kept returning to that envelope. There comes a point in grief where you realize you're not afraid of what happened. You're afraid of what you'll remember. And this letter, it felt like remembering had taken physical form. I sat. My hand hovered above the paper, not ready to bridge the distance. I thought about her last days, the way she'd look past me sometimes, as if seeing something I wasn't allowed to. The nurse had said, "She went quietly," as if quiet were a virtue. But quiet can be cruel. It hides what we most need to hear. I took a deep breath that felt older than my body. "Whatever you're trying to tell me," I whispered. "Say it gently." The sound of my own voice startled me. It was steadier than I expected. Loss had not broken me. It had simply rearranged the pieces. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I walked through the house one more time, the letter clutched to my chest like a small, stubborn truth. In the hallway mirror, my reflection met me with a familiarity that hurt. The same mouth as hers. The same eyes, only softer now. Grief, it seems, polishes us into resemblance. Back in the kitchen, I sat again. The chair acknowledged me with a creak, an old friend remembering its role. Outside, the rain steadied, a rhythm too calm to ignore. I remembered something she used to say whenever it rained for days on end. The earth remembers through water. Maybe that's what I was doing too, remembering, allowing what was buried to find its way back to the surface. I touched the envelope once more. The paper didn't resist. It seemed to breathe under my palm, like something waiting to be forgiven. I whispered, "I can carry you now." And with that, I slid a finger beneath the flap. The glue gave way easily, a quiet release, like an exhale after holding breath for too long. The paper unfolded in my hands, trembling slightly. Before I looked at the words, I paused, honoring the moment between before and after. That thin, sacred line that separates ignorance from understanding. The rain softened. The clock continued. My pulse kept pace with both. Some things survive us, and now I was ready to find out why. If a room can remember your name, maybe a heart can too. And if you're listening from somewhere far, leave a note below. Tell us where in the world this story found you. I didn't read the letter right away. I thought I would, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, letting the paper rest between my fingers like a fragile pulse. The ink waited quietly. The silence waited louder. It's strange how something so thin can feel heavier than grief itself. Paper holds more than words. It holds breath, intent, everything that was never spoken aloud. And this letter, it wasn't just a message. It was a mirror. A final conversation that time had delayed for 30 years. I stood and walked to the sink, needing something to do with my hands. The kettle sat there, waiting like it always did. I filled it, turned on the stove, listened to the water hum before it boiled. Sometimes that sound feels like prayer, steady, repetitive, forgiving. I poured the water, added tea, watched the swirl of brown deepen in the cup. It was an ordinary moment, but the kind that makes you realize ordinary things are the only things that last. The letter stayed on the table. My eyes returned to it again and again, like a tide that refuses to withdraw. It seemed alive, as if it knew it was being resisted. I circled the table, tracing the outline of its shadow. The afternoon light changed. It crawled across the floor, stretching toward me. I had no more excuses. I sat. The air felt heavier now, charged. My heartbeat echoed inside my chest like the ticking clock on the wall, measured, nervous, unwilling to stop. I turned the envelope over again, smoothing the paper where it had folded. My name stared back at me in her handwriting. I whispered it aloud, not for the memory of her voice, but for mine. Elena. The sound trembled slightly. I hadn't said my own name like that in years. Softly, like it mattered. I thought of the last time I wrote to her. It wasn't even a letter, just a small card with a painted rose. Happy Mother's Day. 3 lines of politeness. A signature that didn't dare to be tender. She had kept that card in her Bible. Now, here I was, holding the one she had never sent. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 women, mother and daughter, speaking to each other through paper, when what we needed most was to have spoken aloud. I looked around the room. Everything had the same quiet dignity she carried. A table polished too often, a window that opened reluctantly. Even the plants on the sill leaned inward, as if learning silence from her. I took another sip of tea. It had already gone cold. Still, I drank it. Sometimes comfort doesn't come from warmth, but from the act itself. The letter waited. So did I. I remembered her hands. Always busy, always fixing. Even when life fell apart, her hands kept mending. Hems, curtains, things that didn't need saving, but received it anyway. Maybe this letter was another one of her repairs, a final stitch in the fabric she'd spent a lifetime trying to hold together. I brushed a finger over the first line. The ink was faded, but still there. Stubborn, like her. I read the date. June 14th, 1993. She had written this exactly 2 weeks before she died. The realization caught me off guard. I could almost see her then, sitting by this same window, sunlight on her face, pen in hand, holding back more than the page could contain. For a moment, I didn't read the words. I just looked at them. Because words written by someone who's gone have their own kind of life. They breathe differently, slower, deeper. It felt wrong to rush them. It felt wrong to rush her. When I finally began, I read the first sentence in a whisper, as if the walls needed to hear it too. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. I paused. The words didn't sting. They landed softly, like something I'd already known but refused to name. She'd always been more precise in writing than in speech. On paper, she told the truth. Out loud, she disguised it with chores and politeness. I read on. I've written and destroyed this letter more times than I can count. Words never felt safe in our house. They always came back louder than I intended. That made me smile, sad and real. It was true. We were a quiet family, but our silences had volume. They filled rooms like perfume you couldn't wash off. You were the kind of child who asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. You noticed everything, even what I tried to hide. I closed my eyes. I could see it, my young self, curious, relentless, wanting to understand the world through her. But mothers are not worlds to be mapped. They are galaxies that choose what light you see. I was never good at softness, she wrote. My own mother taught me that love was duty and silence was strength. I tried to give you something better, but I think I gave you both. The words trembled on the page. Or maybe I did. Either way, they found their way in. I rested the letter on the table, breathing carefully, as if any sudden movement might erase the ink. I felt the weight of generations in those lines. Women who learned survival as language, who stitched their hearts closed and called it virtue. I looked at the rain on the window, fine and silver now. It no longer sounded like sadness. It sounded like rhythm. Everything in the room seemed to sway with it. My breath, the clock, the tiny flame of the candle I'd lit without thinking. It was as if the house itself was learning to breathe again. I picked the letter back up. She had written on both sides of the paper, her handwriting smaller toward the end, as if she were racing time. I didn't know how to be a mother to someone who saw me so clearly. You scared me, Elena. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right too early. That sentence undid me. It was the first time she had ever admitted fear, not of the world, but of me. And somehow, that made me love her more. I pressed my hand to my chest. The air felt heavier, but it didn't hurt. It felt like truth rearranging itself inside me. I didn't read further that night. The page ended mid-thought, and I decided to honor that unfinishedness. Grief, after all, never really finishes its sentences either. I folded the letter carefully, not to hide it again, but to keep its warmth. The paper had absorbed the heat of my hands, and for a brief moment, it felt like she was here, not in memory, but in texture. I placed it back on the table. The candle burned lower, its light trembling on the edge of flame. Outside, the rain turned to mist, blurring the garden into softness. There was no pain, no drama, just presence. And in that quiet, I understood something simple. Sometimes the heaviest things we carry are made of paper. I sat there a while longer, tracing the edge of the envelope, whispering words she'd never hear but I needed to say anyway. They weren't forgiveness or apology, just recognition. Before I went to bed, I placed the letter beside me on the nightstand. Not because I feared losing it, but because I didn't want it to feel alone. Some stories take years to arrive. Others wait until the house is empty and the heart is quiet enough to listen. This one had done both. And though I didn't yet know what truths waited beyond that first page, I knew this much. I wasn't the same woman who found the letter. Something had already begun to shift. The letter was lighter in the morning, or maybe my hands were steadier. Either way, when I unfolded the page again, the room did not tilt the way it had last night. Light fell across the table in a narrow band, turning the paper pale gold. I took a breath long enough to make room for what I had not yet heard, and I began to read where I had stopped, right in the middle of a sentence, the way losses often leave us, unfinished, but undeniable. The ink had thinned toward the bottom, as if time itself was drawing the last of her strength through the pen. She had dated it, careful as always. June 14th, 1993. 2 weeks before she left. There is a kind of honesty baked into dates. They don't try to soften the truth. They simply stand there, unblinking, like doorways you must choose to walk through. Her first full line that morning met me with the gentleness I had asked for. I've written and destroyed this letter more times than I can count. I could see it. The ash at the bottom of the sink, the smell of paper in summer air, her stubbornness negotiating with her fear. I imagined how many almost letters she had made, promises she tore into neat pieces so no one would know she had tried. Sometimes attempts are a kind of love. We just don't recognize their shape until later. She continued, "Words never felt safe in our house. They came back louder than I intended." That made me smile, the helpless kind of smile that kisses sorrow on the forehead. We were a quiet home with noisy meanings. Everything we didn't say filled the chairs, stood in the hallway, lay down between us at bedtime. If silence were furniture, ours would have been an heirloom set. I read on. You were the kind of child who asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. You noticed everything. There was no blame in it, only the simplest statement of fact, like weather. I thought of the pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe, notched with my growing height, each line a record of a body learning its reach. No one ever carved notches for questions, but I had grown by those too. Then came the sentence I had avoided last night, the one that made my chest open as if the ribs were a window. I married your father because it was the next right thing. He was kind, dependable, steady. But there was someone before him. I let the paper lower to the table and simply breathed. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like proximity to the truth, the warmth a person leaves in a chair after standing up. Love before love is not theft. It is history. And history does not ask our permission to exist. I lifted the page again. When I lost him, I promised myself I'd never need anyone that much again. And then you were born, and I broke that promise instantly. A sound escaped me, half laugh, half ache. I pictured her, younger than I am now, holding me like an apology she didn't yet know how to forgive. Need is not weakness. It is the way life insists on being shared. There was a paragraph where her handwriting leaned harder into the paper, the ink a little darker, old emphasis pressed into fibers. I didn't know how to be a mother to someone who saw me so clearly. That was the sentence that kept me in my chair. I remembered asking why we never told stories about our family the way other people did. No legends, no scandals, just recipes and chores and weather. She would pat my hand and say, "We are not the kind of people who make a fuss." But fuss isn't a kind of person, it's a kind of permission. We had simply refused it. Another line, the one I think she wrote slower than the rest. I was never good at softness. My mother taught me love was duty and silence was strength. I tried to give you something better, but I think I gave you both. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling how it fit along the old places I used to bruise. There is a moment when a wound stops asking for a reason and starts asking for water. This was that moment. I didn't need explanation. I needed tenderness. And here it was, paper thin and strong enough to hold me. I paused and let the room be a room again. Chair, clock, window, air. The clock kept its modest courage. Outside, the garden lifted its damp green toward the light. I thought of all the times I had mistaken order for love, polished surfaces, rehearsed phrases, my tidy little self walking around feelings like a woman in a museum who refuses to touch the edges of frames. I wasn't angry with her. The anger I had carried all these years stood up, stretched, and went to find a warmer coat. I turned the paper and found more of her. Smaller letters, slightly hurried, as though the body was telling the truth in its own dialect. You asked me once why I never cried at funerals. It's because I learned to bury things while they were still breathing. I swallowed. So did the past. There is a bravery that looks like cruelty from the outside, an economy of tears. I had judged her for it. Now I felt the cost. Then this. I kept a letter once. It was for you. From a man I couldn't let close. I did not flinch. Not because it didn't matter, but because some truths arrive like someone you've seen in photographs all your life. You already know their face, even if you've never touched it. I imagined the envelope she burned, the way flames lick information into secrecy, the ash that refuses to leave the porcelain of a sink. The world is full of stains you can only sand away with years. She pressed on. He said he had your eyes. I thought I was protecting us both. But there are ashes I still dream about. I closed mine and let the ashes drift where they needed to. My childhood had room for exactly one father, and he had been kind. Kindness does not erase absence, it simply gives it a softer chair. Some families are built, some are chosen, and some are held together by the gentlest glue of pretending. I decided to let the pretending go, but keep the kindness. It was the clearest thing we had. I kept reading until I reached the place where her voice, even on paper, seemed to lower itself to a whisper. If I ever seemed cold, it's because I was afraid warmth would make me weak again. I touched the line with the side of my finger, the way you touch a sleeping child's hair so they won't wake. Weakness is a word we inherited like a cracked plate. We used it carefully, felt ashamed of its chip, and set it at the back of the cupboard where company wouldn't see. I wanted to lift that old dish into the light and call it by its truer name, tenderness. She wrote, "I thought silence would keep you safe from my mistakes, but silence is a thief. It takes more than it protects." I felt the theft land where the anger had just vacated. Not as accusation, but as gravity. How many laughs had I kept small? How many questions had I folded into the hem of dinner conversations? How many times had I taught my daughter to read my moods instead of my words? The ledger balanced itself in me. No one guilty, everyone human. I set the letter down and stood up, not because I couldn't bear it, but because I wanted to feel it with my whole body, not just my eyes. The floor gave its soft complaint, as if reminding me that houses learn our weight and forgive it 1,000 times. In the window's reflection, my face looked both older and more like a beginning. Grief had done its quiet carpentry. Something fit now that hadn't before. I returned to the table and gathered the page back into my hands. One day, when you're old enough to understand the kind of love that wounds and heals at the same time, you'll forgive me. Not because I deserve it, but because you'll see yourself in me. I did not argue. I had seen myself in her all morning, her mouth in my words, her patience in my movements, her fear in my caution, her endurance in my breath. The trick is not to exile the inheritance. The trick is to give it a new job. There was one last paragraph on the page, a small island of script with space around it, like she had cleared a field so the sentence could grow. If the day ever comes when you must choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, choose yourself. Peace that costs your voice is only silence wearing perfume. I laughed then, helpless and grateful. It was the first time I had ever heard her sound like a woman who could have been my friend. Not a mother issuing doctrine, just someone who had lived long enough to stop decorating pain. I pressed the paper to my chest and sat quietly with it. No sobs, no collapsing into old theatrics. Just the calm recognition that I had been waiting for this instruction my entire life. To choose myself without apology. To let love be a door that opens both ways. I folded the letter and unfolded it again, as if my hands didn't trust that memory would be as faithful as paper. Outside, a bird tried a few notes and decided to keep them. Some mornings are not for singing, they are for listening to the throat learn its courage. I read the first lines once more from the top, not to mind them, but to thank them. The words were no longer hers alone. They had crossed the threshold. They lived here now, where my breath could keep them. I placed the letter on the table and laid my palm over it. "Thank you," I said aloud to no one and to her, and to the space between us that had finally stopped pretending to be a wall. The air did not sparkle. No miracle announced itself by changing the color of the room. What changed was smaller than that, and greater, my willingness. I did not forgive her in a single sweeping gesture. Forgiveness arrived the way morning had, quietly, through ordinary openings. It sat down across from me, took off its coat, and waited to be noticed. I noticed. I poured new tea, drank it while it was warm, and left the cup in the sink without rinsing it right away. Perfection had lost my interest. Presence had not. Before I left the kitchen, I slid the letter back into its envelope, not to hide it, but to honor it. There is a difference between secrecy and care. One shrinks the heart. The other sizes the heart to fit the truth. As I carried the envelope down the hall to my old room, I realized I was not walking away from the past. I was walking toward the woman I had wanted to be when I grew up, someone who could hold what hurt and what healed in the same hands, without dropping either. On the nightstand, I set the letter beside the small mirror she used to keep. My face and the envelope shared the frame for a breath, and I saw us both. The daughter reading, the mother allowing herself to be read. I whispered the words I had once thought I'd never say and mean. I see you. The room received them without echo. Some truths don't need to return to be real. They only need to land. I sat on the bed, the springs answering with their old hymn, and rested there until the light thinned to afternoon. In that quiet, I understood why her words had waited for 30 years, so that they could arrive in a house finally empty of performance, in a heart finally willing to believe that love without honesty is only fear in its Sunday dress. I lay back and let my eyes close for a moment. I didn't sleep. I simply rested inside the admission that had changed everything. I was not the only one who learned to keep the peace at the cost of herself, and now neither of us had to. When I rose, the letter rose with me, lighter than before, which is to say properly heavy. I was ready to carry it to the next room, to the next part of myself that still needed to hear what she had found a way to say. I opened the door, and the hallway made room. It always had. I was the one who had been too narrow. Outside, the rain had gone. The world smelled like something clean enough to begin again. I walked toward the old room where my childhood waited, not as a trap, but as a mirror I could finally look into without flinching. And I took her with me, the way a voice takes a breath. The morning after I finished reading the letter, the house felt different. Not lighter, exactly, just truer. As if the walls had dropped their posture and decided to breathe again. I moved slowly through each room, touching the corners of furniture like one touches a scar. Not to reopen it, but to remember the shape of what healed. Every object seemed to hum faintly with recognition. The glass, the floor, even the small clock on the mantel, all of them, tiny archives of what had been lived and left behind. Grief doesn't disappear. It changes jobs. It stops being a wound and becomes an interpreter. That morning, mine translated everything into tenderness. The letter lay open on the kitchen table, waiting for me. The pages had softened overnight, absorbing the moisture of rain and the quiet ache of comprehension. I sat beside it and traced the faint crease running down its center. Even the fold felt symbolic, as if she had divided her story just enough for me to unfold it later. There was more on the back of the last page, the ink thinner now, like she had been running out of time or energy or both. I turned it carefully, and the words caught the light like something newly awake. "I wasn't brave, Elena," she had written. "Brave is telling the truth before it turns into silence. I waited too long." I closed my eyes and exhaled. Her honesty pressed softly against my ribs. I didn't read further for a while. Instead, I listened. Not for voices, but for meaning. There's a difference. Voices fade. Meaning stays. After a while, I picked it up again. She had written in shorter sentences now, each one like a breath she had to rest between. "I kept your questions in a drawer," she wrote. "I told myself I'd answer them when life calmed down. It never did." My throat tightened. How many drawers had I filled with my own later? How many things had I postponed under the disguise of responsibility? We inherit more than habits. We inherit emotional architecture, the rooms our mothers never entered, the locks they never opened. And here she was, leaving me a key she never had the courage to use herself. "If I could give you anything now," she said near the end, "it would be permission, to need, to say, to change your mind without apology." The words blurred, not from tears, but from recognition. Permission, that was the word that broke the spell of generations. I realized, as I whispered it aloud, that no one had ever given me that before. Not her, not the world, not even me. I set the page down and looked around the room. The air shimmered with dust motes moving through sunlight, slow and certain. It felt alive, not haunted, just inhabited by something honest. And in that stillness, something inside me spoke back. Not her voice, my own, softened by the places she had once been afraid to enter. I whispered into the quiet, "It's all right, Mother. You can rest now." The silence responded the way water does when a stone touches it, expanding gently, never breaking. That was the first moment I understood that listening could be a kind of dialogue. I walked down the hallway with the letter still in my hands. Every step echoed differently now. Not hollow, not heavy. Somewhere between. The space between grief and gratitude. In my old room, the air was cooler. The curtains moved slightly, though the window was closed. I sat on the edge of the bed, letter open across my lap, and looked around. The wallpaper was faded, the colors softened into memory. Everything had aged, even the light. It no longer insisted, it lingered. I read the next paragraph aloud, not to summon her, but to honor her effort. "I thought I could keep you safe by keeping you ignorant," she wrote, "but ignorance grows roots, and fear feeds on them. If I could start again, I'd let you see me fail." I smiled faintly. Failure, the forbidden language of women like us. We were taught to survive quietly, to tidy the evidence of suffering. But failure is the most human form of truth there is. It's how the soul exhales. The page ended there. No farewell, no signature, just white space. The part of the letter that wasn't written but still spoke. Sometimes silence is the last sentence. I held the pages for a long while. The ink no longer belonged only to her. It had become a bridge between us. It didn't accuse or justify. It simply existed, and I think that's all either of us ever wanted, to exist in peace, without needing to be right. When I finally stood, the letter felt lighter in my hands. Or maybe I had grown stronger. I walked to the mirror and caught my reflection. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. I looked like a woman remembering her origin story. I thought of all the times I'd looked into mirrors before, checking for lines, for signs of age, for proof that life had passed through me. But now I looked for something else entirely. Not youth, not time. Truth. The reflection was steady. Her eyes in mine, my mouth shaped like hers when thinking too long. But there was something new, a gentleness she had never worn, but that I now did. That was how I knew the healing was real. It had changed my face. I folded the letter once more, carried it back to the kitchen, and placed it by the window. Light pooled over it softly, as if giving its blessing. I whispered, "I forgive you," and meant it, not as a declaration, as a realization. Forgiveness doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives like light through lace curtains, so quietly that you only notice when the room has already changed. I left the letter there for the afternoon sun. It deserved warmth. We both did. For hours I moved through the house, cleaning, sorting, humming under my breath. Not out of duty, out of relief. When evening came, I lit a single candle. Its flame trembled, then steadied. The air hummed again, familiar and alive. And in that vibration, I felt her presence, not as something returning, but as something finally understood. It was then that I realized she had never really been gone. She had simply been waiting for me to listen without fear. That night, before sleeping, I placed the letter beside me once more. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. It was already written somewhere deeper. The house creaked softly as it settled into night. The clock ticked like a heartbeat, learning patience. Outside, the sky folded itself into indigo. I whispered, "Good night," not to anyone, but to everything. And the quiet that followed didn't feel empty at all. It felt full, like something holy, something finished, something loved. By the time morning came again, I was ready to stop remembering her as absence. There's a moment in grief when the person you lost stops being a wound and becomes a weather. Something that surrounds you without asking permission. That morning, I woke to that kind of weather. Quiet, steady, everywhere. I made coffee instead of tea. It was a small act of defiance, or maybe renewal. The kind of choice that says, I'm still here, and I'm still deciding. The steam curled upward, slow and graceful, and I thought of her again, always standing by the stove, finding small ways to make order out of chaos. I had inherited that from her, the urge to fix, to tidy, to make peace with what was breaking. The letter lay open on the kitchen table, its edges slightly curled from the damp night air. The words no longer hurt. They hummed quietly now, like something settling into its final shape. I ran my fingers across the lines, tracing the rhythm of her hand. For the first time I realized, these were not confessions. They were instructions for healing, disguised as guilt. I sat down and began to read the last page again, letting the words unfold at their own pace. By the time you read this, you'll be older than I ever was allowed to be. I paused there. The sentence had weight, the kind of truth that doesn't move quickly. Older than she ever was. I had outlived her, outaged her, walked into years she had never reached. It felt strange, almost disloyal, to keep living past someone who taught you how. But maybe that was the point, to finish what they began. You must forgive me for mistaking control for love. They wear the same shoes and walk the same roads, until one forgets why she left home. I smiled through the ache of it. Yes, that was her. Control and love, walking hand in hand until one got tired of pretending to be the other. I had done the same, with my daughter, with my students, with myself. I had called my worry care. I had called my fear protection. And all the while, love waited at the door, patient, knowing I would eventually recognize her. I read the next line aloud, just to feel how it sounded in the air. Tenderness was the only courage I never learned. The word tenderness lingered after I said it, soft but unstoppable. It spread through me like light through water, touching everything it passed. That's when I understood something I'd never seen before. Every act of silence between us had been her way of saying, I love you, but I don't know how to do it without trembling. And somehow, that made me love her more, not for her strength, but for her limits. I had spent a lifetime worshiping women who endured. Now I wanted to honor the ones who tried and broke anyway. I rested my elbows on the table and pressed my palms together. Outside, the garden was waking. A thin layer of mist hung above the soil, like breath you could see. Everything looked new, though nothing had changed. That's how forgiveness works. The world doesn't rearrange itself. Your vision does. I looked back down at the page. If you have children, tell them you were afraid. They'll understand more than you think. I smiled, thinking of my daughter. She was in her 30s now, strong and stubborn, with the same impatience I once had. I had always tried to be the mother mine couldn't be. Gentle, transparent, modern. But now I saw that I'd inherited the same quiet armor, just in prettier colors. I had taught her calmness when what she needed was truth. I had mistaken serenity for love, the same way my mother had mistaken silence for safety. It was the same pattern, only better dressed. I whispered into the still air, I'll tell her. I promise. The words didn't echo, but they landed. That was enough. I went on reading. Tell them you made mistakes from love, not from malice. And when they make theirs, Don't rush to correct them. Listen. Listen. That word broke something open in me. Not a wound, a gate. Because for the first time, I realized I hadn't been listening to her all those years. I had been hearing her silence through the noise of my own hurt. But now that I had stopped defending myself, I could finally hear her intention. And what I heard was simple. Love. Trying its best with the tools it had. I laid the paper flat and stared at her handwriting. It felt like she had reached across time to place her hand over mine. The page looked ordinary, but everything around it pulsed with new meaning. Even the air felt rewritten. Love and absence. I had thought they were opposites, but they are twins, really. Absence is love's way of teaching us to find it elsewhere, to grow an ear inside the heart that can hear without sound. I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair. The wood creaked softly, a sound like understanding. I thought of her kitchen, the same walls, the same light, the same ritual mornings. Only now, she was here through me. Her gestures lived in my movements, her choices in my hesitations. That realization was both humbling and divine. I whispered, "You're forgiven." And for the first time, I didn't mean it as an act of generosity. I meant it as an act of equality. We were two women standing at the same threshold, both tired of carrying misunderstanding as inheritance. We had finally laid it down. For a long time, I sat there watching the light shift on the table. It moved across the letter slowly, like blessing. The world outside sounded softer. Even the ticking clock seemed less strict. Maybe time was listening too. Then, quietly, I whispered to her again. Not out loud, but inside. I told her that I understood why she couldn't say these things before. That life had not given her the language. That I didn't need her to apologize anymore. And in the space that followed, I felt something close to peace. Not the dramatic kind that floods you, but the subtle kind that rearranges your pulse. Like forgiveness written into the rhythm of breathing. I stood up and walked to the window. The sky was pale and open. A single bird moved across it. Not fast, not slow, just sure. I thought of how many years I had spent believing love meant holding on. But love, real love, is the ability to release without losing, to let something rest without calling it gone. I turned back to the letter one last time and ran my fingers over the final lines. When you have the chance to love again, do it without armor. There's no such thing as safe affection. Love is meant to change you. That's how you know it's real. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The line stayed in me like music, unfinished, echoing, eternal. I folded the pages slowly, carefully, as though closing a prayer. Then I pressed the envelope to my chest, feeling the soft thud of my heart beneath it. That was the sound of something ancient being rewritten, not erased, rewritten. I whispered, "You can rest now." But the truth is, I was the one who finally could. The house asked nothing of me that morning. It waited, the way a shoreline waits for a tide it now understands. Forgiveness had changed the pitch of the rooms. Even the floorboards seemed to breathe at a truer depth. I held the envelope against my chest for a moment longer, then set it down and let my hands be empty. Empty hands know how to receive. Something in me wanted to walk the hallway I used to run, not to collect ghosts, but to return them to a gentler light. So I went, slow steps, soft heel, careful silence, and listened to the familiar sequence of creaks beneath my feet. They sounded like names spoken in the right order. My old door was almost closed, not quite. It had always preferred in-between states, ajar, almost, nearly. I rested my palm on the frame before entering, as if asking permission from a part of myself that slept here and had never once complained about the draft. The first breath of air was cedar and dust and the faint sweetness of something stored too long. Light gathered along the wall like a patient animal. The wallpaper's blue flowers had faded into a tender gray. They looked like memories that had decided to be kind. I stood very still and let the room recognize me. It did, quickly, completely, without ceremony. I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress offered its old sigh, dignified and loyal, and I felt my body settle into a posture it hadn't used in decades, the shape of a girl trying not to disturb anything. I smiled at her. I told her it was safe to exhale. On the nightstand, the small oval mirror waited, its surface softened by years of breath and cloth. I lifted it and caught a version of my face that belonged here. Not the one life had weathered, but the one this room had expected to see again someday. I brushed a thumb across the glass. It did not clear the blur. It simply warmed to my hand. This was where my mother used to sit behind me, knees touching the frame, letting my hair fall through her fingers in long, patient lines. No stories, no lectures, only the rhythm of bristles and breath. I had mistaken that quiet for absence. Now I could hear the language inside it. I am here, and I am trying. We speak our best truth in the dialects we're given. I opened the window. Air that had been waiting came forward, gentle and green, carrying soil, roses, a little sun. The garden's wet earth darkened like a page taking ink. I could just make out the place where I had tucked both envelopes into the ground the night before, a small square of mercy among the roots. I did not think of it as burial. It felt like planting silence in good soil so it could learn to bloom into voice. I reached into the drawer and found the old hairbrush. The wooden back had a smooth oval from years of use, the exact size of my palm. I drew the bristles through my hair the way she did, slow, shoulder to shoulder, crown to nape, and the motion gathered both of us into its patience. There are gestures that carry a house inside them. This was one. The mirror caught the light again. For a moment, my face arranged itself into hers. Not a haunting, just an overlap. Same mouth, same stubbornness around the eyes, but softened by something she didn't get to keep. I let the resemblance stay as long as it wanted. Then I let it go. I walked to the closet and opened the door. Inside, a row of quiet colors, each with its own temperature of memory. The blue dress she wore to church in summer, the cardigan with the repaired elbow, the apron that still knew the shape of her hands. I put my fingers into the elbow's mend and felt the small ridge of new thread inside old wool. We last. We last in the places we repair. On the highest shelf, a shoebox. Inside, ribbon, a Christmas card without an envelope, a few photographs that never made it to frames. One of them held me at 9, front tooth missing, cheeks round with victory, a little smudge of jam on my chin. Behind me, slightly out of focus, my mother at the sink, bent, attentive, unadorned. If love were a camera, it would keep the background for evidence. I sat again and placed the photo on my knee. How ordinary we looked, how perfect that was. I traced the silhouette of her shoulder with my small finger, then with the older one I have now, and whispered into the room, I know. No explanation, no list. Only the verb. Knowing is a home. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the room overlay itself on time. The same curtains, the same chair, the same chorus of minor sounds. From the yard came a single bird call, patient, unhurried. I remembered the lullaby she hummed when storms argued with the roof. It had no words, only movement. I hummed it back, a little off-key, and no one corrected me. That felt like a kind of blessing only the past can give. I stood and crossed to the window again. Wind nudged the lace into the room and laid it down, a white breath on the sill. The garden gleamed. I rested my forearms on the frame and let my body learn the posture of someone who belongs. I had confused ownership with belonging for most of my life. This house reminded me, you belong where you are gentle. I spoke to her then, not to call her up, but to let the speech complete itself, "Mother," I said, the word easy at last. "I forgive us." The sentence surprised me, both directions at once. It felt right as soon as it landed. Forgiveness is an ecosystem. Nothing heals alone. A thin warmth moved along my shoulders. Not hand, not wind, just a small shifting in the air that knew my name. I did not reach for it. I received it. Not every door needs a handle. I went to the dresser and pulled out the bottom drawer. Beneath folded pillowcases lay the quilt she had begun and never finished. Squares of retired dresses and retired aprons, patient geometry awaiting a final seam. I spread it across the bed and smoothed each panel. There was a place where two fabrics met awkwardly, color against color in a quarrel, and a single stitch leaped a gap to keep them neighbors. I rested my fingertip on that stitch. We had been that stitch for each other, and sometimes the gap. Either way, the quilt stayed. I lay down on the patchwork and stared at the ceiling, where a tiny crack mapped itself from corner to corner like a river that had decided not to be dramatic. The house exhaled. I matched it, breath for breath, a duet without melody. It occurred to me that I could leave this room now without taking anything from it. The girl I had been here didn't need rescuing anymore. She needed recognition, and she had it. Recognition is a form of release. I folded the quilt carefully and returned it to the drawer. I closed it without the small shove it used to require. Some resistances loosen only when you stop insisting on them. I wanted to do one last thing. I took the letter from the nightstand and set it on the bed, then brought from the hallway a small dish of water, a white hand towel, and the hairbrush. I arranged them the way she once arranged care. Practical, unannounced. Then I sat, dipped my fingers into the water and smoothed the linen of the pillow with the back of my damp hand. Care changes the temperature of a room. It did now. I combed my hair again, this time more slowly, as if measuring the distance between who I was then and who I have become. The space was not as wide as I had imagined. Grief had built a bridge without telling me. I spoke one more sentence into the air. Simple, earned. "Thank you for staying until I could see you." The truth of it settled everywhere. Not a miracle, not a sign, only the clean alignment of things finally placed where they belong. The window, the quilt, the brush, the picture, the breath, each held a corner of the room, and the room held me. When I stood to leave, I did not look back to make sure the door was closed. I left it the way the day had left the night, open enough for exchange. In the hallway, my steps sounded different, less like departure, more like returning. The house accepted this version of me with a softness I recognized as my own. Before I reached the kitchen, I paused by the mirror and faced myself the way one faces company you actually wants to keep. Lines, light, work of years, work of love, nothing to correct, everything to keep. I touched my cheek with the same 2 fingers she once used to check my fever and felt only temperature, steady and ordinary. Ordinary had become holy. Back in the kitchen, I poured water into the kettle and waited for the low call that meant readiness. I placed the cup by the window and unfolded the letter one last time, not to read, but to let it rest in the day. Sunlight crossed the page as if it knew the route. I reached into the drawer for another piece of paper, a clean sheet, and set it beside hers. There was no rush to write. Peace does not hurry you. It invites. I looked at the garden and thought about the last part of this journey. There would be a reply. Not as argument or defense, not even as closure, but as continuation. 2 envelopes in the earth, 2 women in one breath, one life learning to speak in a warmer grammar. I took a sip of tea, now perfectly made, and let it linger on my tongue. I could taste everything. The leaf, the heat, the cup, the morning, the work we had done to arrive here. And I knew with the calm certainty that doesn't need witnesses that the final movement would be simple. A letter written without armor. A gesture made without audience. A goodbye that was more like a vow. When I finished the last sip, I placed the cup in the sink without rinsing it. Evidence is allowed. Then I gathered the clean page to my chest, placed my hand over my heart to mark the rhythm I wanted the words to keep, and sat down. The room leaned in. The window brightened. The clock forgot to be stern. I began to think in sentences I hadn't learned from anyone else. They were mine. They would be enough. And that is how I moved from the room where I once waited to be loved into the room where I would love back. In ink, in earth, in a voice that no longer apologized for being warm. I picked up the pen, not to fill silence, but to honor it. The next page was ready. So was I. I didn't start the letter right away. The page waited beside the window for almost a whole day, collecting light and dust like patience made visible. There's something holy about waiting when it isn't punishment. It becomes a kind of listening. And that was what I needed before I could speak. Not words, but understanding. When I finally sat down to write, the world was between seasons. The last gold leaves hung loose on the branches, unwilling to fall, and the air smelled of endings that didn't hurt anymore. I opened the window just enough for the room to breathe with me. The wind moved through gently, rearranging nothing, only confirming what already belonged. I took up the pen, and before the first word appeared, I whispered to the empty air, "This isn't for you, Mother. It's for us." The pen agreed. It didn't scratch or rush. It simply followed the rhythm of my pulse. Dear Mother, you left me silence, and for years I called it abandonment. Now I see it was space, a garden I didn't know how to enter. I'm in it now, tending what you planted. The soil remembers your hands. I remember your effort, and that is enough. I paused. The sound of the clock slipped into the distance, replaced by something slower, the low hum that happens when heart and hand are in agreement. You wanted to protect me from pain, and I mistook that protection for distance. You wanted to teach me strength, and I mistook it for coldness. You loved me in the only language you were allowed to speak, and I judged you for not being fluent in mine. The sentence felt like an embrace that had been waiting 3 decades for a body to hold. I pressed the pen's tip to the paper and let the ink pool slightly before I moved on. I wanted the words to have weight. If I could stand in front of you now, I would tell you that your silence built the shape of my listening, that the steadiness you carried in your hands became the calm I carry in mine. You are not the wound I thought you were. You are the seam that kept me together. I stopped again and smiled, small, unguarded. Outside, the light softened further, taking on the color of old photographs. I wrote through it. You told me, in that letter, to choose myself when peace demanded my voice. I have, and because of that, I can love you without needing to make you different. I exhaled. The sentence tasted of freedom, quiet, not triumphant. Freedom never raises its voice. It simply refuses to whisper. I don't forgive you because you were wrong. I forgive you because you were real. The line stopped me. I read it twice, maybe 3 times, then laid the pen down and stared at it. Real. That was the word I had been reaching for all along. Not perfect, not good, just real. It was enough to build a world. The candle on the table had burned low, its wick bending slightly in exhaustion. I replaced it, lit another. The new flame rose eagerly, bright, unafraid. I smiled at the metaphor, unashamed. My mother would have laughed at me for that, and then I think joined me. I kept writing, not in long paragraphs now, but in small, complete breaths, the kind of sentences that don't need readers to live. I'm learning to rest without guilt. I'm learning to speak without noise. I'm learning to keep the door open without waiting for anyone to walk in. And I'm learning to love you in the present tense. That last line stayed with me longer than the others. Love in the present tense. It felt like the most accurate description of faith I'd ever written. I leaned back in the chair and watched the shadows lengthen along the floor. The day was slipping toward evening, and the house had begun its usual symphony. Pipes murmuring, wood adjusting, air changing temperature. But nothing sounded lonely anymore. Absence, when understood, becomes accompaniment. I lifted the pen one more time. If love has a voice, I think it sounds like what the house is doing now. Settling, forgiving, continuing. So I will let you go in the same way. Not erased, not idolized, simply included. You were never gone. Not really. You were just waiting for me to arrive where you had always been. I placed the pen down and sat with what I had written. No tears this time, no trembling. Just stillness, rich and whole. The paper beneath my hand felt warm, almost alive. I let my palm rest there until the warmth became my own. Then I folded the letter carefully, pressed it into an envelope, and wrote her name on the front. Not Mother. Her full name, the one she rarely used, the one that belonged to her before anyone called her something else. It felt right to speak to her as the woman she had been, not just the role she had carried. I slipped on my coat and stepped outside. The air was cool, but kind. The garden, damp from the night before, smelled of rain and roots and small forgivenesses. I knelt by the rose bush, the one she'd planted the year I turned 10, and made a small hollow in the soil. The earth yielded easily, soft as breath. I placed the envelope inside and covered it gently with my hands. Here, I whispered. Here's what you couldn't read, but always knew. The wind moved through the branches, quiet but unmistakable. It sounded almost like a sigh of relief. I stayed there for a while, not praying, not speaking, just letting the air pass through my open fingers. When I stood, I brushed the soil from my palms and looked up. A thin strip of moon had risen. Early, silver, patient. It felt like punctuation, the right kind. Back inside, the house greeted me with a silence I no longer feared. It didn't echo, it held. That's how you know healing has taken root. The same silence that once hurt now comforts. I made tea and sat by the window again, watching the light dim around the garden. Somewhere, in the distance, a clock chimed the hour. I smiled, thinking of how time keeps its promises even when we forget to keep ours. I took a sip, closed my eyes, and let the warmth spread. There was no more letter to read, no more truth to uncover, no more ghosts to convince. Only the steady rhythm of life continuing, without permission, without apology. And then I whispered, not to her, not to myself, but to the space that now held both of us. I understand. The room didn't answer. It didn't need to. Some stories don't end. They dissolve gently into peace.